If you're like me, then the current situation in the Middle East is completely baffling to you. Negotiations falling through, a preemptive Israeli strike on Iran, followed by an equally strong Iranian retaliation, strikes on US military bases, all culminating in a ceasefire shakier than a crappy amusement park ride at my local county fair. With the sheer magnitude of information coming out, mixed with the frequency and immediacy of said information, it's pretty difficult to understand everything that's going on. In this episode, I hope to better explain it to you all. I'm not a hack. As always, I'll be upfront about my views on the conflict, but the facts I bring you are unbiased so that you can make up your own mind on what is now a Middle East Cold War that's about to get hot. I'm Andrew White, and this is a podcast where we believe less is more. I hope you enjoy. Alright, guys, I suppose a good way of starting off this show would be to explain the current situation as it is, then go from there. On June 13th, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear sites and government personnel. Now, aside from being my birthday, June 13th was important because 2 days later, Iran was scheduled to meet with Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, in a 6th round of talks regarding Iran's nuclear program. In case you couldn't tell, these talks never really materialized. So according to the Times of Israel, the IDF launched a surprise attack on Iran carried out in different waves. The initial wave entailed around 200 fighter jets dropping 330 munitions on 100 different sites. In addition to the attacks from the jets, Mossad agents had infiltrated Iran in the time leading up to the attack, and on the night of June 13th, released drones from within Iran that attacked Iran's air defense system. As a result, the Israeli attacks on Iran were far more effective than Iran's attacks on Israel. The IDF then began a campaign of decapitation, as they put it, in which they used highly specialized explosives to take out high-ranking government personnel, including military officials, politicians, and nuclear scientists. Iran retaliated with their own strike on Israel. They launched thousands of missiles at Israel just hours after Operation Rising Lion began, in their own campaign named Operation True Promise. Iran attacked a myriad of targets, including military bases, government buildings, nuclear sites, and even aspects of Israel's energy infrastructure. However, the Iranian strikes were far less effective than their Israeli counterparts. Just to put it into perspective for you folks, sources say that Iran's interception rate of Israeli attacks was around 5 to 10%, while Israel's interception rate of Iran's attacks was a staggering 90%, mainly due to their Iron Dome military infrastructure. So as we can see, the ratios are nowhere near close. Now, if things weren't crazy enough, after days of Trump just edging the press about it, on June 21st, the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer, a covert operation that targeted Iran's chief nuclear sites, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Basically, what happened was Trump had a fleet of B-2 stealth bombers fly west towards Guam, an American territory in the Pacific where we have a bunch of military bases, early in the day on June 21st. Their deployment was very public. All of the news outlets were reporting on it because, they thought this was how Trump's attack on Iran would take place, right? Now, with the entire world focused on the planes headed to Guam, Trump secretly deployed another fleet of bombers headed east towards Iran. These planes were the ones that ultimately dropped the bombs that night. The next day, as the brutal strikes between Israel and Iran continued, Iran launched a series of missiles at American military bases in Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. However, before doing so, they apparently called not just the leaders of the countries whose airspaces they fired into, but Trump as well, to let him know about the incoming strikes. Because of the warning, only one missile managed to make it past defenses and ended up doing no substantial damage, which leads us to the situation we have now. Later in the day, on June 23rd, the same day Iran attacked American bases, Trump tweets out, let's pull it up. Fuck. Okay, so Trump, he tweets out, I got the fucking tweet pulled up. So Trump tweets out, "Congratulations to everyone. It has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire." And then he gives a bunch of shit. I'm not going to read the whole thing out right now, okay? But I'll read you some highlights. So Trump says, In approximately 6 hours from now, when Israel and Iran have wound down and completed their in-progress final missions for 12 hours, at which point the war will be considered ended. Officially, Iran will start the ceasefire, and upon the 12th hour, Israel will start the ceasefire. And upon the 24th hour, an official end to the 12-day war will be saluted by the West. So that's something. Definitely something. I saw Dave Smith had a good point about this tweet. He was talking about how it's kind of crazy to name drop a war not even a day after it's over. Like, when the 6-day war happened, I doubt they decided to call it the 6-day war on the 7th day. Like, come on, guys, let the temperature in the room cool down a bit. But moving aside the name, Trump abruptly just declares a ceasefire. We're done, we can move on, the war's over. Well, it might not be. So, to point out the elephant in the room, the terms of the ceasefire are cryptic, to say the least. For one, after reading that tweet, it's really hard to figure out exactly when the ceasefire is supposed to take place. For one, he says the ceasefire is not in place yet. Then he says that Iran will begin the ceasefire in 6 hours when he says it'll begin, yet Israel won't join until an additional 6 hours after that, placing at the 12th hour from the original tweet. So right off the bat, it's just overtly complicated. And then as soon as this tweet drops, an Iranian official comes out and says nobody ever talked with them about a ceasefire. Then after staying silent for a few hours, Israel says they've agreed to the ceasefire, but only after a heavy final bombing run. Then Trump gets mad at Israel. It's just a complete shit show, folks. Roll clip.
You have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because of one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
They don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't know. But the big question on everyone's mind here is why? Why is any of this happening? And why is it so hard to understand? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to go over a little history lesson. So most countries around the world have a history of coups d'etats and regime changes at the behest of my country, the US. Iran is no different. In 1953, the US and British intelligence agencies overthrew Iran's then democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. We did this because President Mossadegh had a crazy, radical idea that the oil fields of Iran belonged to the people of Iran. So he nationalized them. The new government, put into place by the Brits and Americans, was under the rule of a dictator called the Shah, or King. The Shah's first move, once made ruler, was to consolidate governmental power and globalize Iran's oil fields, allowing British and American companies to drill on them. For 26 years, the Shah remained in power in Iran, acting effectively as a Western puppet. During his time, Iran saw a period of liberalization in which the Shah tried to make Iran more Western. Examples of this include land reform, building of infrastructure, and giving women the right to vote. However, he was incredibly corrupt and dictatorial in his rule, and the rapid secularization of Iran was an ultimately unpopular move amongst the people. So in 1979, they overthrew him and replaced him with a theocratic government led by traditional Shia Muslim clerics, or mullahs, who have ruled over Iran ever since. The philosophy of the mullahs was one of Islamic fundamentalism and strong anti-Western sentiment. The policies of the regime strongly reflected these beliefs, with policies such as closing universities deemed too Western, implementing gender segregation, and requiring a strict Islamic dress code for anyone leaving the home. However, as the mullah regime progressed, one political policy in particular would put them in hot water with the West: their fierce opposition to the state of Israel. As crazy as it may sound now, Israel and Iran haven't always been enemies. During the rule of the Shah, Iran and Israel maintained an alliance. Even during the rule of the mullahs, Israel's worked with Iran. During the Iran-Contra affair, Israel was the key middleman who transferred weapons from the US to Iran. Without the weapons, Iran would have likely lost the Iran-Iraq War soon after it began. However, publicly, since the Islamic Revolution in '79, Iran has maintained an aggressive aversion to Israel. Israel has responded with a similar aversion. However, up until 2025, the two had never directly fought, instead choosing to sponsor different proxy groups in various conflicts across the Middle East. This has embroiled the region in a cold war of sorts between the two powers. There are other players too. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and up until a few months ago, Assad's Syria come to mind. But to understand the conflict today, you just need to understand the rivalry between these two, Iran and Israel. Even more important than the countries sponsoring proxies are the countries sponsoring those countries. China and Russia quietly back Iran, while the US vocally backs Israel. Both of them received weapons from their backers, and it was exactly with these weapons that the 12-Day War was fought. But why would Iran hate Israel so much? Some reasons are valid, others are the craziest things you've ever heard. Iranian hate towards Israel comes from a fundamental idea held by the mullahs that Israel is an illegitimate state which violently oppresses the Palestinians who live there. There are other reasons too. The Ayatollah will often wield genuinely anti-Semitic rhetoric, and I'm careful when I use that word. I know it's been co-opted by unsavory actors to demonize people critical of Israel. That is not at all how I'm using it here. The Ayatollah is someone motivated by a deep, irrational hatred of Jews, and in no way am I minimizing that. That being said, the treatment of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government, especially lately in Gaza, has been absolutely deplorable. Now, the Israel-Palestine conflict is something that requires titanic nuance to explain and understand. It honestly deserves an episode all to itself. I'll go over the basics, though. For almost all of history, Jewish people, due to their small population, had to live as minorities in their countries. In these countries, Jews would frequently be the victims of violence, causing them to flee from place to place. In the 19th century, a Jewish political thinker named Theodor Herzl created a concept for a country with a majority Jewish population that would serve as a homeland for all Jews. This idea was called Zionism. Now, Zionism didn't require a specific location for the homeland to be. In fact, early proposals called for the Zionist state to be settled in present-day Uganda. However, due to scripture and the Torah promising an eventual state for the Jews in Palestine, Uganda was off the table pretty early. By the time Theodor Herzl died in 1904, the plan for a Jewish state in Palestine was set in stone amongst early Zionists. They moved to the then Ottoman-controlled Palestine in a series of waves called aliyahs. There was just one problem. There were already people on the land. This was made even more contentious when during World War I, the British made separate promises to the Arab and Jewish populations of the land, promising them a state there. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Britain took control of Palestine through the 20s, 30s, and World War II. At the end of the war, a partition plan separating Palestine into two states, an Arab and Jewish one, with Jerusalem serving as an international city accessible to both peoples and governed by the UN, was proposed. According to the UN, Jews made up about 33% of Palestine's population at the time, and Arabs made up about 65%, with the Druze minority occupying the last 2%. The partition plan would have given 55% of land to the Jews. This land consisted of most of the coast. However, around 60% of the land partitioned for Jews was taken up by the large and uninhabitable Negev desert. In contrast, the partition plan would have given only 45% of the land to the Arabs. However, this land was viewed as more valuable due to the settlements on it and the ability for the land to be farmed. The Jews accepted the partition plan ecstatically. The Arabs did not. In 1948, a coalition of Arab countries launched a war against Israel. In addition to that, the Arab population within Palestine launched a civil war. There was massive unrest in Israel during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but it culminated in an Israeli victory in which they captured parts of territory allocated to the Arabs in the partition plan. To put it into perspective, according to the UN, the territory allocated for Jews in the original partition plan was 55% of Palestine. After capturing territory during the war, the Israelis now controlled 78% of Palestine. The only areas the Israelis didn't capture were the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. Most Israelis, you ask, will call this war the War for Israeli Independence, or the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But there's another name for it. one the Palestinians use. The Nakba, or catastrophe. It's called this because, according to Israeli historian Benny Morris, during the war, over 726,000 Palestinians were made refugees. In areas of Palestine that had been captured and areas of high Arab resistance, vast numbers of Palestinians fled due to brutal fighting happening or bloodbaths at the hands of Israeli soldiers, such as the Deir Yassin massacre. It's important to note that there were massacres of Jews as well, such as the Kfar Etzion massacre. Both sides committed horrible atrocities, and at the end of the day, it was the civilians, both the Jew and Palestinian, who suffered. But the Israelis won the war. The Palestinians who'd fled during the war had ended up primarily in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. After the war, the Israeli government enacted a policy preventing Palestinian refugees from returning to their homes. Israel viewed a large Arab population within their borders as a security risk, and as counterthetical to their goals of establishing a state with the majority Jewish population. I can't explain the entirety of the Israel-Palestine conflict in this episode. Like I said, this could easily be an episode of its own. I'll end the history lesson by asking a question. Why does history matter? Why does it matter? Because it's the root of everything happening today. Up until now, I've left out one key detail about the Nakba. It never ended. The Israeli government never let the Palestinian refugees go back to their homes or communities. Instead, they kept them inside heavily blockaded areas like Gaza, where they're economically bankrupt, starving, and most importantly, unable to leave. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Israel would be involved in a series of wars with its Arab neighbors. Some wars were started by Israel, others by the Arab states. During the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel gained nearly 3 times the amount of territory it had previously through its capture of the Sinai Desert, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza Strip. Israel has now captured not just all of Palestine, but vast swaths of Arab land as well. Much of the land captured by Israel is still held by it to this day. The fate of the people living on the land varied greatly. The tribesmen living in the sparsely populated Sinai Desert were allowed to stay. The Sinai was eventually given back to Egypt in 1982 as part of Jimmy Carter's peace negotiations. The Arabs in the Golan Heights weren't so lucky. According to the MERIP, around 95% of the Arab population living in the Golan Heights were forcefully removed from the land and fled to other parts of Syria. In the years following the Six-Day War, Israeli settlers would move into the conquered Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza Strip, and the process was often very violent. So you know how during the 1967 war, Israel captured all that territory? With the exception of the Sinai Desert, Israeli military personnel and settlers are still there to this day. The only slight exception being the Gaza Strip, which Israel withdrew from in 2005, only to place an economy-crushing embargo over the Strip. To put it into perspective, the American Great Depression, the worst economic crisis my country has ever faced, took out about 30% of the American economy. Israel's post-occupation embargo took out over 40% of the Gazan economy. Israel claimed that the embargo was to prevent weapons and dangerous material from getting into the hands of Hamas, the radical Palestinian terror group that had taken over Gaza since Israel withdrew. The dangerous material, quote-unquote, that the Israeli government blocked from entering Gaza included cement, gasoline, and chocolate. This embargo is still in effect to this day, and most human rights organizations describe it as an extension of the occupation. So let's backtrack a bit. Remember Iran? After the mullahs took over in 1979, they declared Israel as an existential enemy. The mullahs then began a campaign of funding terrorist groups across the Middle East that oppose Israel. Some of these groups include Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and most importantly, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is a terrorist group based in the Gaza Strip. It formed during the occupation of Gaza and committed violent acts of terror against IDF soldiers and Israeli settlers in an attempt to drive them out and regain Gazan sovereignty. Both during and after the occupation, Hamas remained a controversial force amongst the Gazans. After Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Hamas won a small plurality, not even a majority, of the Gazan election. Hamas then took complete power over the Gazan government and have ruled it with an iron fist ever since. The entire time that Hamas has run the Gaza Strip, they have been receiving weapons and aid from Iran. The thing is, Israel also supports radical groups in the Middle East that maybe could be seen as terrorist groups, such as Jundallah and Kurdish separatists. The only difference is that the groups Israel supports oppose Iran. This has created a Cold War in the region between Israel and Iran. What makes this Cold War different, though, from the one between the US and USSR is that both powers have even more powerful countries backing them. As I mentioned earlier, why is this important? Why is it important? Good question. It's important because it could start something big. Famously, the First World War began out of a quagmire between different alliances across Europe. All it took was one leader to get killed for the brutality of the war to break out. As the years have gone on, we have become further and further removed from the lessons of that war. Over the past 25 years, the US has gotten involved in a series of wars in the Middle East. Many people will claim that we fought all these wars at the beck and call of Israel. In reality, it's more complex and nuanced than that. The reality is that the US interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen were motivated by a myriad of reasons, and our close relationship with Israel is just one of those reasons. There were other reasons as well. A jingoistic neoconservative being in the presidency certainly didn't help. But to pretend like our close ties with Israel didn't at least influence these wars slightly is laughable. Every one of the countries we overthrew were long-standing enemies of Israel. Iraq specifically was seen as a counterweight in the Middle East to both Israel and Iran, as it was a strong regional power run by Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Muslim who opposed both Israel and the Shia Muslims who ruled Iran. When we overthrew him, it created a massive power vacuum to be filled with Israeli and Iranian proxies. Since our crusade of terror wars against these countries, Israel has become more and more powerful. I'm not saying that's an inherently bad thing, it's just a consequence of these wars. This series of wars has worried Iran because as time has gone on, they've gradually become the sole power opposing Israel in the Middle East. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists rode into Israel and committed the largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Israel responded with a highly controversial invasion of Gaza, aimed at taking out Hamas. In the invasion, according to the Gazan Health Ministry, over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed, with the vast majority, around 70%, being women and children. Women and children, man. Fuck. Israel claims that the large death tolls were due to Hamas intentionally hiding amongst the civilian population. Their invasion has also included a brutal bombing campaign that destroyed over 70% of the infrastructure in Gaza. As a result, almost all Gazan schools have closed down or been destroyed. Nearly all of Gaza's electricity and water infrastructure have been destroyed. Around 2/3 of all Gazan hospitals have been completely destroyed, and the remaining ones have been struck by missiles. Personally, I find the invasion completely disgusting, but we'll get to my opinion in a sec. What this invasion accomplished, though, was a weakening of Hamas. Although they weren't destroyed, they were incredibly weakened. In addition to Hamas, the countries which opposed Israel alongside Iran have had their regimes change. Iran is now solo, left in fear. Now that their allies in the Middle East have been wiped off the map, they have no one to turn to. China and Russia support them, but they would never come to defend Iran militarily. Iran has no one to turn to but themselves, and their solution was to build a nuclear bomb. Nukes are a funny thing in geopolitics. I think Charles de Gaulle, the former president of France, said it best. He said, "In the last analysis, a country like France, with her size, her wealth, the nature of her economy, must be able to say she could cause unacceptable damage to the adversary. From the moment when France could inflict unacceptable damage, she is no longer exposed to attack." Essentially, if you want to be a legitimate power with your own policy and goals, and you don't want to be pushed around by other countries, you have to have nukes. Not to use, but as a deterrent. Relying on another country to provide you nuclear support isn't acceptable either, as that country will forever be able to hold that above you and can take it away at any time. Iran felt this hard and started developing nukes of their own. You may ask, why? Why can't they just agree to a treaty saying we won't mess with them and they won't make a nuke? Well, it's because they don't trust us. Like, at all. So, Muammar Gaddafi, the former dictator of Libya, infamously began developing his own nuclear weapons after feeling threatened by Israel and the West. He gave up the program voluntarily, though, in 2003 in exchange for a normalization of relations with the West. We helped overthrow him 8 years later. I don't know if any of you have seen the Gaddafi death video. It's some pretty dark shit, man. He got sodomized by a bayonet in the streets by rebels that we supported. Pretty graphic stuff. Anyways, the situation with Gaddafi deeply motivated the Iranian drive for a nuclear program, but not as much as the actions of another dictator. This one outside the Middle East. Mr. Kim Jong-un. The United States had long wanted to get rid of the Kim regime in North Korea. George Bush even declared them as part of his axis of evil during his infamous 2002 State of the Union speech. For decades, there had been massive pressure put on the Kim regime to step down. In the 2010s, it looked like that might happen. If it weren't for one little thing, Kim debuted his own nuke. This sent shockwaves, quite literally in some cases, across the globe, but above all else, it cemented an idea in the global collective consciousness. North Korea doesn't F around, and we shouldn't F around with them. Since North Korea's thermonuclear test in 2017, the United States has completely stopped putting pressure on North Korea in fear the Kim regime might be more liberal with their nukes than other powers. It also sent a message to countries around the globe. Develop a nuclear bomb, and you won't have to worry about your regime going anywhere. And no country received this message as loud and clear as Iran, who began rapidly developing their nuclear program around this time. Another key factor that led to the rapid development of Iran's nuclear program was the JCPOA. So the JCPOA, or Iran Nuclear Deal, was a deal cut by Obama. And I'll say this about Obama. He was an incredibly complex president. I have mixed opinions on him. I think his foreign policy was largely terrible. I can go into that in another episode. This deal was one of his best accomplishments in office. The deal lifted decades-old sanctions on Iran from the West in exchange for the mullahs agreeing to not enrich uranium past 3%. Now, you've probably heard that term a lot in the news. Uranium enrichment. Uranium enrichment refers to the process of perfecting uranium for practical use. This is done through putting the uranium through a series of centrifuges, which filter the uranium into usable state. When occurring naturally, uranium is around a 0.7% enrichment level. If enriched to between 3 and 5% by man, uranium can be used for nuclear power. If enriched to about 20%, uranium can be used for medical purposes. It's not until uranium is enriched to 90% that it can be used for a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA limited Iran's enrichment levels to, like I said, around 3%. And allowed for international inspectors from the IAEA to come in and ensure that Iranian enrichment was not going above that level. Donald Trump left that deal in 2018 and imposed even harsher sanctions on Iran than before. This, combined with Kim's nuclear development, provided the perfect motivation for the mullahs to accelerate their nuclear program, which is precisely what they've done. In 2021, the IAEA, or International Atomic Energy Agency, reported that Iran had begun enriching up uranium to 60%. The Biden administration responded with strong condemnation, but it wasn't until 2025 that we would hear anything of the Iranian nuclear situation. At first, it seemed like Trump had learned some actual lessons from his first term, when he barred war hawks like John Bolton from security clearances, and announced a 60-day window of nuclear talks with Iran, led by Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, who showed promise early on. However, during the talks, Trump and Witkoff drew a red line at any uranium enrichment for Iran. This was a no-go for the Iranians from the beginning. Trump knew it, Witkoff knew it, and the entire public knew it when on June 13th, exactly 61 days after Trump announced the nuclear talks, Operation Rising Lion began. So that brings us to the current situation. What do we make of the events of the 12-day war? Is it even over yet? What is Iran's endgame? What is Israel's endgame, for that matter? How does the US fit into all this? Good questions. Let's go through them. So what the hell was the 12-Day War? Well, I'll answer that. It was a giant shit show. The entire justification for the war was that because of their fundamentalist values, Iran was crazy, and if the mullahs were able to create a nuke, they wouldn't care about self-preservation, so they would just drop it without any fear of a retaliation at all. Here's the thing, though. I don't think this was ever about nukes. I really don't. Simply because no new information came out about Iran's nuclear program since the IAEA's 2021 statement. In fact, earlier this year, March specifically, our own Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, under oath, stated that the mullahs have not revived Iran's nuclear weapons program, which has been suspended since 2003. The reason why they've enriched uranium up to 60% is for use as a bargaining chip. After Trump left office in 2021, the Iranians hoped to make another deal with the US to guarantee Iranian sovereignty. They managed to enrich uranium up to 60%, but specifically stopped there. According to the IAEA, the task of enriching uranium from 60% to 90% is not difficult at all, and would only take about 10 to 14 days for Iran. Yet throughout the entirety of Biden's term, the IAEA uranium inspectors consistently said that Iran had not enriched any further. All of this so explicitly points to the idea that Iran was not attempting to actually build a nuke. They wanted to use the 60% as a bargaining chip to give them some standing when they would inevitably have to make a deal again. What all this proves is that the justification for the strikes on Iran was just complete bullshit. The Ayatollah of Iran is not some madman who will destroy his own country if it means destroying Israel and the US. He's a regular human, albeit a crazy one, but he has self-preservation. Iran does not want a war with Israel and the US because they know they would lose. The mullahs know their regime is weak and clearly care about preserving it above destroying Israel and the West. This is only further proved by the fact that when they attacked our bases in the Middle East after Operation Midnight Hammer, they called to let us know that the attack was coming so we could stop it. It's ridiculous. And the actions taken by Trump in this situation can only be described as playing with fire. I mean, just imagine for a second that Iran actually was as crazy as they'd been made out to be. Just imagine if instead of launching only 19 missiles at us, 18 of which were shot down, by the way, Iran had launched a full-scale barrage at every single American base in the Middle East. Hundreds, if not thousands of Americans would be dead. If Iran had retaliated with even just the same level of jingoism as Israel or the US, we'd be in a full-scale war. The only reason why we didn't was because of the self-restraint of the fucking Ayatollah of Iran. It sounds crazy saying it, but it's the truth. So why did we do it then? Why did we strike Iran? I can only speculate, but I'll give you my best. Israel has always longed for the day when the mullah's regime will come tumbling to the ground, and honestly, that's not even an inherently bad thing. I mean, like I said, the mullahs are absolutely deplorable in all measures. However, just because a country's evil doesn't mean we should go topple their government. Just remember the situation in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a brutal and ruthless dictator, yet the American invasion in 2003 left the Iraqi people off even worse than under the government of Saddam. The reason why Israel began striking Iran was to enact regime change. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is currently facing criminal charges with both the Israeli courts and the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The only thing keeping him from facing these charges is his position as prime minister. The Israeli political system, it's really complicated, with tens of parties coming and going during each election cycle, some surviving for longer than others. Netanyahu's government, which has been in power since 2021, is made up of a coalition of right-wing Israeli parties, right, with the Likud being his. One of the most famous or infamous players in this scene is Bezalel Smotrich, a key ally of Netanyahu and his finance minister. Smotrich is a radical Israeli expansionist. He was even born to Israeli settlers in the Golan Heights. His rhetoric is fucking crazy. I have a list of quotes from him right here. In the documentary Minister of Chaos, Smotrich, when asked about whether or not he would support an Israeli expansion, said, "Absolutely, but slowly. Our great religious elders used to say that the future of Jerusalem was to extend as far as Damascus," which is in Syria, by the way, like deep into Syria. In August of 2024, Smotrich said, "My life's mission is to build the land of Israel and thwart a Palestinian state." When asked about the Israeli invasion of Gaza, he said, No more raids or in and out operations. Now we must conquer, cleanse, and stay. Which is like a crazy thing to say. A fucking insane thing to say for a Israeli politician in power. Then in another interview for another documentary, this time called Israel Extremists in Power, which is a pretty fitting name, Smotrich went as far as to say, I want a Jewish state that includes Jordan, Lebanon, parts of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Jerusalem is destined to extend to Damascus. Do I need to go on? I think you can tell that this guy is nuts, but why is he so important? I mean, he's not the prime minister. Well, he might not be the prime minister, but he has the prime minister by the balls. Although Smotrich's religious Zionist party is relatively small within Israel, it provides a crucial backbone to Netanyahu's government, as without it, he would not have a majority of seats in the Israeli Knesset and his government would collapse. Smotrich has repeatedly threatened to do this, saying that if the Israeli troops in Gaza are withdrawn, he'll collapse the government, putting Netanyahu out of power. And it's not just Smotrich either. Netanyahu's defense minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has promised to do the exact same thing if the war in Gaza ends. All of this puts our good friend Bibi Netanyahu in a bit of a pinch. The amount of international condemnation towards Israel has gone up exponentially since the war in Gaza broke out. It's kind of crazy, actually, if you think about it, because at the beginning of the war, the Israelis had almost unilateral support across the West, only for it to completely fall off because of how horribly they've treated the people of Gaza. I'm convinced there will be some kind of an end to the war in Gaza soon. There's no way around it at this point. On top of that, Netanyahu has his criminal charges, which will come to bite him in the ass when he's out of power. So Bibi's faced with a choice here. Either accept the inevitable, or launch another war to please your supporters. And that's precisely what Netanyahu did. Operation Rising Lion was his chance to start another war, to keep his government in power. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. Iran is a gigantic country, about 75 times bigger than Israel in land area. It also has one of the most extreme geographies of any country in the world, with vast mountains on all of its borders, and running through the country. Likely the only military in the world that could take out the mullahs is the United States. Netanyahu went into this war with the explicit intention of dragging the US in at some point. There's really no other way around it. He saw the cold gavel of justice coming and did his best to avoid it. He even succeeded at dragging the US into it, at least partially. However, the ceasefire eventually came and the war ended. So where does he go now? I don't think there's anywhere for him to go, because right now all he's doing is buying time. If the war in Gaza ends and he has no other war to satisfy the radicals in his cabinet who are keeping the government afloat, then he's toast. Because of this, Netanyahu is going to do everything and anything that he can do to justify resuming the war with Iran. So where does America fit into all this? I'm American. I care about America. Where do we fit into all this? Well, at this point, we just so happen to be the most consequential player on the chessboard. Trump ran on a platform of anti-war. He's already somewhat broken it with the strikes on the Houthis and Operation Midnight Hammer. But he genuinely seems like he wants to keep America out of a larger scale war with Iran. After all, it was him who put the ceasefire together. However, I wouldn't be entirely sure one way or the other. Trump has gone back on his word multiple times on Iran. For instance, although he publicly supported Steve Witkoff's nuclear negotiations, after Israel struck Iran, he came out and said that not only did he give the Israelis the go-ahead to strike, but he also did the push towards diplomacy to fool the Iranians. Which, by the way, if that's true, that the diplomacy was a ruse, what a coward. Seriously, if that's true, then Trump is the biggest coward ever, even bigger than the Ayatollah or Netanyahu. But even if Trump is actually trying to push for a diplomatic solution to the conflict, Netanyahu can't be trusted. When Trump negotiated a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, Israel broke the ceasefire, going completely against Trump's agenda. If I had to speculate on what happens from here, I would say that Netanyahu is going to break the ceasefire with Iran at some point. At this point, I'd love to be wrong about that, but I would say that Netanyahu is going to break the ceasefire with Iran at some point. At this point, he has nothing to lose and everything to gain. The question is whether he'll break it tomorrow or 3 months from tomorrow. That is the question. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Less is More. Once again, I'm Andrew White, and if you like this podcast, drop a like, a follow, give me a good rating on Spotify, and with that, I will see you in the next one. Bye.